Greetings everybody and welcome to one of our Flowgear bite-sized videos, the purpose of which is to get you, the integrator, up to speed with some of the very important features and concepts within the Flowgear platform. And on top of that, we'll be looking at one of our very common use cases. The very first thing we're going to want to do is to log into our Flowgear tenant. Now we will have provided you with a Flowgear tenant ID. You can see I've plugged mine in on the top here, and then you'll obviously provide the user against which you would like to authenticate. Once that's been done, you can go ahead and click on Next, and that's going to log you into the Flowgear console. Now, based on the user you provided, your role will determine what you can and can't do. So through role-based access, effectively, you'll be able to navigate to certain portions of the Flowgear console. Now, ultimately, each of these Flowgear tenants is deployed against its own VM, which is going to provide you with a maximum level of separation and security. Now, the primary purpose of the console is to provide you, the user, with a space in which you can seamlessly transition to the different elements of the platform that you may find yourself working with. How this is functionally done is through selecting any of the navigational elements of on the navigation bar on the left-hand side. Let's start at the bottom, and we can go through a handful of these. Starting with drop points. Drop points are a lightweight agent that you can install on-prem, which is going to facilitate a persistent outbound connection to the primary Flowgear environment. What this functionally means is, irrespective of where your primary Flowgear environment is hosted, you're going to be able to install this tool directly on another on-prem system and still be able to get data to and from your Flowgear environment and the system in which you've installed the tool against. Connections are a place to plug in credentials unique to a particular platform or product. So if we open up one of our connections, just as an example, Salesforce, you'll notice that we can plug in credentials that would serve to authenticate you with Salesforce. And we'll be specific around what we require within the naming of the particular properties. And you can also take a look at our help article, which is going to give you an idea of what each one does and how you could potentially acquire it. Now, you can effectively go and test against that as well using the test connection button. There we go. You will then note that you have in fact been able to connect to that environment. You'll also see that you can go and click on different environments here. Test UAT in production. Functionally, this allows you to plug in different sets of credentials for the different environments you may own or have access to. Now, you can customize this. You can have additional environments. You can change their names. You can remove some. Ultimately, we're not always aware of what your environment looks like in terms of lifecycle management, so you get to set it up according to what your current policy or procedure has been up until this point. It also plays a large role in how we do lifecycle management in general within Flowgear, and we'll get to that a bit later as well. Now let's take a look at workflow logs. This is a place in which we are able to store the transactional inputs and outputs of all the nodes that have executed within the platform. And you can see what those inputs and outputs are here. You can also redact that as well. So anything you do not want to be stored can be redacted and therefore will never be stored on the Flowgear platform. And functionally what this place does is it allows developers or anybody developing or maintaining these solutions to have a very good view of what has happened on the platform so that they could potentially debug and solve a problem should one arise. It's not going to fill the purpose of reporting to your end users or integration reporting in general. Those kinds of tasks whereby, as an example, you want to report a number of invoices processed, which of them failed and why they failed, that would be something that is built alongside the workflows themselves. Finally, we can take a look at workflows. Workflows are the design canvases on which we actually build these solutions. So here's where we then facilitate that drag and drop and low to no code design. And we're going to go ahead and open one up and give you a bit more detail around what that looks like. Let's go ahead and open up a brand new workflow. You can go ahead and do this by clicking on the new workflow button over here. We'll then have a randomly generated name, which of course you're welcome to change. And we can go ahead and confirm that on the bottom right. We're then greeted with a Flowgear design canvas, the primary purpose of which is to expose all of Flowgear's pre-built tooling so that you, the integrator, can drag and drop that onto the canvas and then build some kind of integration or automation, really to whatever level of complexity you require. Now, as I've said, there's a big emphasis on drag and drop, and there's an emphasis on low to no code based on your preference and the kind of tools you'd like to use. Now, how we can expose these tools to the canvas is by clicking on any of the plus icons you see popping up as I hover around. And we're then going to be greeted with these tools as a list of nodes. We call them nodes. They're best described as elements that can be dropped onto the design canvas that will then provide a particular integration process. So in other words, they're going to be doing something for you. Now, depending on what they're doing for you, we'll have them categorized into one of 4 distinct categories. The very first category is our connectors. They will effectively connect to the systems that we want to integrate and automate, and they do this by exposing as much of that vendor's API functionality as is possible, and exposing those actions at something called samples. That might not make a lot of sense right now, but you'll see exactly what that looks like a little bit later. We then have triggers. Triggers will determine the condition upon which a workflow executes. So in other words, it allows you to determine whether your workflow should execute once daily, based off of an email arriving in an inbox, a particular queue. There are a number of mechanisms to determine whether your workflow should kick off. Processes are going to work with data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prepare it for the next stage, whether that's one of many or the final stage of ingress. Effectively, what these nodes will do is ensure that you can enrich, supplement, transform, and validate the data to get it into the systems that you're actually attempting to integrate with. And finally, flow control gives you the ability to enable conditional branching on the canvas, and that conditional branching will form the high-level logic for things like error handling, business logic, any kind of decision making that the workflow has to actually make, even if that data has to be handled by a separate workflow or anything of that sort. Now, ultimately, it's a collection of all of these nodes that allow you to build these integrations to whatever level of complexity you require. Triggers are then going to facilitate the condition upon which the workflow executes. So it will determine whether your workflow should kick off twice daily, once an email arrives in a particular inbox, monitor a particular queue. There's a number of options for why a workflow would or wouldn't kick off. We then have processes, the primary purpose of which is to go ahead and work with the extracted data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prep it for the next step, whether that is one of many steps or the final step of ingress. Functionally, they will go ahead and transform, enrich, validate, and supplement those data sets so that you can move them across to the systems you want them to be in. Finally, we have flow control. Flow control nodes will allow you to enable conditional branching on the canvas, which forms a big portion of your high-level logic or decision making. This could be error handling. This could be determining whether a particular process has to be kicked off by a sub-workflow, whether an invoice has to be processed with a different kind of mapping. It is once again going to allow you to make a lot of the decisions that make up your production-ready workflow. It is, of course, a collection of all of these different categories that allow you to build these integrations and automations to whatever level of complexity you require. Enterprise API gives you the ability to turn any workflow into an API-bound endpoint. This means that through the typical design experience within Flowgear, you can go ahead and expose some of that functionality or data to a web endpoint, which can then be consumed by a third-party application or program that has the ability to do so. So here, in a very brief example, we're extracting information from SQL, we're mapping that into a JSON payload, and we're functionally exposing that to an endpoint that somebody can consume. And we can see how this is done by heading over to Settings, Workflow Settings, and we'll notice that we've applied a get binding to this workflow. We have our demo domain, of course, which should be customizable according to your tenant, and then we have the actual URL for test contacts. And should somebody have this URL and the appropriate access token, they can go ahead and extract a list of contacts from the database that we've hooked up within Flowgear. Revision management is a feature which allows you to inspect the design of a previous version of a workflow. You can do so by clicking on the revision history button over here. And then you can take a look at the different versions that had been saved in the past and open up any one of them. That provides you with the design of that workflow at the time that it was saved. You can then even revert to that version as the latest version by saving over the workflow, and you'll be expected to ensure that you are happy to do so by confirming with a yes for confirmation. Revision management is one of the many tools Flowgear exposes as part of our lifecycle management suite. Release management is another powerful feature within Flowgear's suite of lifecycle management tools. Release management works by preventing workflow design changes from immediately affecting production. This is done by enforcing the process of a user with the appropriate permissions promoting workflow design across the relevant environments until it is ready to be promoted into production. Let's take a look at how this is actually performed. So here we have a workflow which we're going to go ahead and save. We can provide a save or commit message over here. And then we'll receive confirmation of the workflow being saved through the green banner. At which point we can go ahead and open up the release management by clicking on this button over here. We will notice that this particular workflow has a version in test, but none in UAT or production yet. And so what we can do at this point is we can actually promote the workflow across to UAT. This will then allow us to execute the workflow in the UAT environment using the credentials that were provided in the connection under the UAT tab. And then once we're happy with that, we can go ahead and do the final portion by promoting this into production. Similarly to what I've just done. Now you're welcome to use the UI that Flowgear exposes to do this, but realistically what's happening in the back end is these particular designs are going to be stored as GitHub commits. And so you can actually see a text-based version of the workflow, which you can then compare against older versions. So while you're welcome to use it in the manner that I've just shown you, ideally you're able to forklift whatever your lifecycle management policy and procedure is into something like a GitHub environment and effectively run your pipelines and your commits and approvals as you've been doing up until now. For this particular demo, we're going to be looking at importing customer information from an Excel document into Sage Intacct. The first thing we're going to do before we get into any of the detail is to take a look at what this integration is actually looking to achieve. And so what we'll do, kicking this off, is take a look at what the source document looks like. Here we have the source Excel document with dummy data, which is of course customer information that we intend to move over into Sage Intacct. Now we can take a look at some of these customer IDs such as 1001, and should we move over to Intacct to try and look for that customer ID, we'll notice that it's not actually in there. We can move back to the integration. We can actually execute this on demand. As we do that, we expect to see the activity log show us what's happening within the canvas and how each node executes. And ultimately, when this has all been done, we can take a look at our customers, refresh this list, and we can now see a ID 1001 for Alice Smith sitting within the Sage Intacct environment. So now that you know that it's working, let's take a look at how this actually was built. Now that we have a blank canvas in front of us, let's take a look at some of the steps we'd have to perform to actually get to the point where we can execute this integration as shown previously. Now the first thing we want to do is get the appropriate nodes onto the canvas. Now with most AppTap integrations, you'll have one connector for your source and one for your target. Excel is going to be a little bit different because we have to fetch that file first and then actually interpret that file. So what we're going to do is place two particular nodes onto the canvas, starting with the file node itself. We have a number of options for these in terms of SFTP, SFTPS. I'm fetching this file from my PC using a drop point, and so we're going to use this particular file node. We then want the Excel node that's going to interpret that file, and then we can, a little bit off to the side here, go and plug in, of course, Sage Intacct, which is going to be the target for the data. At this point, we're going to go ahead and actually pick the connections. So for the file connection, I will pick my NIC laptop connection. If we open this up briefly, we'll note that all I've really done here is I've routed this connection through to my drop point on my laptop. And all we effectively have to do then is actually plug in the path to the file we're looking for. I've got this path on my clipboard, so I'm simply going to paste it in. But of course, you could have this as a dynamic path by providing something into this property over here. We also want to ensure that we interpret this particular file as a binary, not a text. And what we can actually do at this point is we can immediately go and hook up the content to our Excel document section, hook up the execution flows, ensure that we have the right properties set. So there are in fact headers. We'll have an action of open, and we can simply use all text as formatting for now, and we can execute the first portion of the workflow. That's going to give us the activity log and of course show us what's happening. And if we've done everything correctly, what we'll notice is that on the output of the Excel file, and you can always click on that to see what the headers are, we would have table XML with exactly the data we would have seen in that source file. So fantastic. This is working as is. I don't need to explicitly set this value in the node as it will do so implicitly, but let's go ahead and use that anyways to show you how that's now sitting as the data. At that point, we want to have the other side of the experience, which is to get the Sage Intacct connector set up. So we're going to go ahead and close our logs. Once again, pick a connection, in which we'll actually pick Sage Intacct Sandbox. And then as per our branded connectors experience, you can go ahead and open up the options and choose sample button to see a list of all of the samples that we provide for this particular branded connector. Now, the idea here is that whatever kind of documentation that the vendor exposes, we can consume that and provide you with a list of potential actions that you can actually perform against, for instance, the Sage Intacct environment. This works exactly the same for all of our branded connectors. And within the spec of Sage Intacct, we're looking at thousands, in this case, of samples. And so we can go ahead and actually pick the particular sample we want to work with, which is simply create customer. And as we select that, we're actually configuring the node for the action of customer creation. You can see action and object. And then very important, on the request payload is an example of what the customer fields need to look like as they go into Sage. Now what we'll do is we'll actually plug a quick map into the center, which is going to be responsible for transforming the data from one side to the other. And we'll actually give the quick map visibility of both the source and result by hooking up table XML and request as such. At this point, we can actually go ahead and open up the mapping by clicking change view. And we'll notice that we have two data trees, left-hand side and right-hand side. And they're going to represent the data coming from, of course, our Excel document, and then the data that is expected to go into Sage Intacct. And the primary purpose of this space, of course, is to give you a very simple tool whereby you can visually map the structures and the fields that you want into the Sage Intacct structure. You can see that I'm doing this by simply dragging across the field that I want to represent. So let's get, for instance, both first and last name in there. Well, actually, let's first do first and last name on these fields. And we can see how a preview immediately pops up to give you an idea of what that's going to look like. Now, beyond the structural mapping, we give you functions or expressions rather that you can use to further enrich and supplement the data. So you can take that data to a next level of complexity or do whatever you have to do with it. And we support these by plugging in these expressions within the filter expression blocks. Now, these functions are going to effectively be very closely modeled after Excel. We do this for a reason. It's fairly low barrier to entry. And you can see a whole list of those functions here if you're curious what we support. But ultimately, it's things like sum, count, lookup, if statements, any string or math operation. You can use that here to then once again get that data to a next level of cleanliness or accuracy or whatever it is you're looking to do. So some good examples would be to go and pull both first and last name into a single field, in which case we'll use some string manipulation to go ahead and add those fields together. We could potentially make sure that the company name has no white spaces in it by using trim. And if there was some kind of mismatch between the custom ID on the one side and on the other side, we could effectively use a lookup to determine whether the customer ID exists in a tertiary set of data and actually return the proper key or value for that. However, we'll leave it at that. The idea here is that you're then equipped to get the data to whatever the next step needs to be. So we're quite happy with this. We can go ahead and close this off. And as part of the basics of the workflow, which is to extract, transform, and load, we're already at a point where we can hook up all the execution flows, plug it in from QuickMap to Sage Intacct, and actually execute this particular workflow. As we go ahead and execute this workflow, we'll once again notice the activity log at the bottom. This time around, it's going to give you us a retelling of every single one of the nodes that executed. And we can, of course, very importantly, look at what the response from Sage Intacct was, which is to give us a success status on every single one of these customers, which we can then find within Sage Intacct. Now, what this represents is very simply the extract, transform, and load component of an integration. It is the core of most integrations, but it doesn't define the entire integration and its complexity. Generally, we have to do more work to get this to a production-ready level. So let's swap over to the other workflow, which I executed initially, and show you some of what it takes to get something into a production-ready state. Here we have our slightly more complete workflow, and let's touch on some of the components that were added to make this workflow closer to a production-ready version. First of all, you have your schedulers, so you can effectively plug any kind of trigger you want onto the canvas. That's going to dictate in what capacity that particular workflow will execute, so under which conditions effectively. And in our case, we simply have a day scheduler whereby every 15 minutes from 8 in the morning to 5, it will execute this particular procedure. We then have something called a for each, which is going to actually split each record one for one and pass them down individually in case we want to actually have additional logic on that particular record level. And then we have a bit of error handling as well, once again at a record level, whereby we can determine using an if equal, one of many tools we have that can do this kind of operation, where we can see that if Sage Intacct is returning an error or not, and then what our action is on top of that error. So should we log it as a success or a failure? And once it's been logged as such, can a secondary process then come through and pick up that particular transaction and potentially retry it or alert somebody of the failure? I hope that this has given you some insight as to how you would begin solving an integration problem like this using Flowgear. Of course, as I've said, this is not a production-ready workflow. Although we've explored some of the concepts that would be used in a production-ready workflow, there's still a lot to look at. There are concepts such as reducing deltas, which is to return records that have been changed since the last time it saw it, and a number of other complex systems that you can plug into your workflow using the rest of the nodes that you can find within Flowgear. Ultimately, through all of the nodes that we expose, Flowgear is equipping you to build an integration automation to whatever level of complexity you require. If you're interested in exploring some of the concepts and features that I've just shown you in more depth, you're welcome to head over to help.flowgear.net, where you'll find a list of comprehensive articles giving you more detail on some of the things that I've shown you today. On top of that, you're welcome to sign up for a free trial and explore Flowgear at your own pace. We do have a certification course available that'll take you through some of the foundational elements of Flowgear. And then finally, if you'd like, you're welcome to reach out to our team and inquire about a complimentary proof of concept where we can go ahead and show you some of what you're looking to achieve as part of the POC process.